what I think is the highlight of these LERA meetings on a very, very special occasion. We're here, as you all know, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Dick Walton and Bob McKersie's classic book, The Behavioral Theory of Labor Negotiations, and I want to welcome you all to this session. I want to make a special welcome to the family members who are here. We have a very large contingent of Dick Walton's family, Sharon, his wife, and even a grandson is here. And sons and daughters and son-in-laws, and so welcome. Very, very nice to have you here. And to Bob McKersie, Liz is here, and also a granddaughter, Mia, and Michelle are here. So we have a real good representative contingent of the families to celebrate what is really, and for many of us, very much in the tradition of these two gentlemen who have welcomed us into their family, both intellectually but also on a personal basis in so many ways. And so this will be really fun today. We're going to have a large cast of characters that are listed here, and Joel will introduce each of them in good context as we go through this process. We're all going to make brief remarks so that we can have an opportunity for a conversation to both reflect on the work and on the contributions and on what it all means to so many of us. I'm going to start off with a very, very quick thumbnail sketch of kind of the 5 professional reasons why we're here today. Why would we celebrate something 50 years after it's been published? And I must say the first year or two was a little rough in terms of some of the responses this book got. Not from me, because I was still an undergraduate trying to figure out what all this meant, but from others. But it's had an enormous, enormous effect, and I just listed what I think are the 5 things that stand out for me. First of all, it is, beyond question, the most important book on labor negotiations. Of the last 50 years, maybe the most important book ever written as a theoretical contribution in labor relations. But as many of the people in this room will reflect today, it's also probably the one piece of labor relations research that has had more impact on the social sciences generally than anything else that certainly I can conceive of. Joel's going to give you some numbers on that shortly. Then I think there's some pieces of this that are underappreciated. We all know about the book Getting to Yes. It's a classic practitioner guidebook for negotiations. If you really read that book and you look at the underlying theoretical rationale that gives it the life and the meaning, I think you trace it back to the behavioral theory of labor negotiations, something that is, I think, underappreciated by many people who have followed since then. And the same thing about teaching. Many of us here teach negotiations, and some of us will even remember where the ideas and the concepts and the theories that are taught in all business schools and law schools and professional schools have come from. But I'll bet there are a lot of people out there, not in this room, but out there in universities who are teaching this stuff who really don't even understand where it came from, much less appreciate the legacy of this work. And the same goes, we've all done professional training. We've had a program on negotiations that Bob and Joel and Nancy Peace and others developed, and we've been teaching that for well over a decade. That underlies the structure of the practitioner teaching and the program on negotiations outside of the labor field. The concepts you're going to hear about today resonate and are the basis. So this is a landmark achievement, and I can't imagine any other book or any other piece of work that carries forward. I'm going to end my brief comments here, though, on a more personal level, because Bob and I have known each other for a long time. I won't tell you how many years, just a few years. But the Walton and McKersie book, when I first encountered it, I didn't understand it. I was an undergraduate. Couldn't make sense out of it. And it wasn't until I was a graduate student doing research on public sector bargaining that all of a sudden, that's why they behave this way. And that's what's going on inside these city governments and why they can't reach agreement easily. And so this book was the most important piece of work that helped me frame my own research in the earliest stages of my career before I ever met these gentlemen. They had an impact on me. And then Bob McKersie has been just this dear friend, mentor, co-conspirator in lots of activities, colleague, and source of inspiration for all of these years. So there are both personal and professional reasons why I'm here today. And I suspect everybody in this room has their own story, and we'll hear more of those. So with that, let me just welcome everyone. Joel is going to do his magic now with setting this in a bit more context, and then we'll go from there.
Well, thanks, Tom. I did bring some show and tell, and anybody who's brought their copies for signatures, I guess they'll be signing afterwards. But really, it's, as Tom says, you know, an honor and a pleasure to celebrate this book at its 50th anniversary. And what I wanted to do to set the stage for today's discussion is to position the book through what's called a bibliographic analysis. Mary Catherine Kern and Shimin Mi, both at the University of Illinois Library, assisted me in this. And what I'm going to present is sort of first a kind of fun look at the book, and then a more serious bibliographic look, and then at the very end I'm just going to share one personal piece of theory for myself that I'd like to share. But first, what I'd like to do is to take, Google has now scanned about 15 million books, and you can do what's called an n-gram analysis of words and how frequently they show up in most of these. This is the North American English library that they've scanned. And so the first thing that I did, well, actually before we get to that, I just wanted to set the stage. When the book came out, it first of all introduced this term social negotiations. And what's important is that they argued that it's it's a deliberate interaction among parties, and the four sub-processes, which I think are well known to everyone here, these are the actual definitions from the book. What was really important is that they pointed out that in every negotiations, all four are present. And it's something, of course, all of us, when we teach, we talk about this. It's not always heard that way. A number of years ago, I made a series of trips to Poland to work with companies and unions as it was becoming newly privatized in the early 90s. And partway through one of my sessions in which I was talking about integrative and distributive bargaining, at the break, one of the participants who spoke English said that the interpreter was translating it as the good approach and the bad approach. So we have to work hard to understand that, in fact, that concurrent presence of all four elements or sub-processes is what makes bargaining important and difficult to understand, and where the theory really helps us. But with that in mind, I did this n-gram analysis, and this is a chart with, here I could pass these, I have copies of this for anyone who wants copies, but for the panel who can't see the slides, you can pass these down. This basically says, if we take the four words from the title, theory, labor, behavioral and negotiations, the word theories had a really good run over the last 2 centuries and continues to be highly present in these scanned books. The word labor had a concurrent, equally important run up until about 1940, and then it's had some decline in terms of its presence. Negotiations really doesn't show up until really the early 1960s, and the rise is, I think, the behavioral theory. We'll talk about that in a minute. The word behavioral, actually that shows up right in the 1960s. Negotiations has had a pretty good steady run. If we take integrative and distributive, they're both words that have been around a while. The word integrative, as the book indicates, really rises with Mary Parker Follett and then further with the behavioral theory, at least concurrently in time. The word attitudinal had a good run, but seems to be declining, and we feel sorry for intra-organizational bargaining. It's never quite taken off, and in fact, Dave Lipsky, who, by the way, can't be with us and sends his regrets, although we'll share a few of his thoughts, argues that we need to do more research on intra-organizational bargaining. But if we take the words integrative bargaining and distributive bargaining, attitudinal structuring, and intra-organizational bargaining, it's all the behavioral theory. But once again, it's really integrative and distributive that have had more purchase, although, as the book reminds us, you need all four elements to understand what's going on. And in fact, as some of you may know, when the theory was first being developed, and you may hear some of this from Bob and Dick in their remarks, the original theory only had the three elements, and the intra-organizational didn't show up till later on when they were going through these transcripts of negotiations, and there were things that you just couldn't explain with just attitudinal structuring, integrative and distributive. And so the intra-organizational, although it's got the lowest frequency around, I still think it's underappreciated and needs to be have the volume turned up. But here's what Tom was referring to. The librarians were able to help me using the Web of Science to start in 1965, and we won't talk about the year 1973. Tom has an opinion on that. That was the year of his dissertation. At least he did his job. But what you see is the frequency with which the book has been cited over the last 50 years. And to my view, this is the bibliographic image of a classic. You really see that the book continues to show up and be cited. And more importantly, perhaps, if we take the citations to people who cited the work, we get an image of the way in which it has just built. That the number of people citing the behavioral theory continues to grow and build on itself in a fairly impressive way. And I put this slide together. I don't know if you can read it in the back, but this is the top 125 people who have cited the behavioral theory. What's fun is that as you read the list, at least for me, I know at least half the people on here, and it's really the who's who of not just the industrial relations field, but as Tom was saying, there's behavioral psychologists, there's economists, there's organizational theorists, there's human resource management folks here. It's just decision science folks are here. So you really get the sense of the breadth of the impact of the Walton and McKersie book. And these, I guess, Bob and Dick, are your new best friends. But just to conclude, I also want to put the book in context. What we did is we identified what I call an incomplete list of classic books on negotiations. And this is a combination of the Web and the Science and Scopius in terms of the frequency cited. I put in red the top 5, and Tom Schelling's book, Strategy of Conflict, sort of bridged from political science into many areas and stands out. But the behavioral theory, Getting to Yes, Howard Rafa's Art and Science, and Max's work on judgment and managerial decision-making all stand out as in this top 5 of books that are cited in negotiations. If we look at the Google Scholar, which is a slightly broader scan, again, it's in the top 5. If we look at library acquisitions, it's actually not in the top 5. So they accomplished all these citations, even though librarians were not acquiring the book as frequently as some of other texts in the field. But the key thing is that among negotiations books, generally, this is one of the top 5 most cited works, and it has that bridging quality that's so important. The last thing that I want to share is just from my own personal experience, which was really just a life-changing experience to apprentice myself to Bob and Dick in the Strategic Negotiations book. And what for me was sort of one of the critical insights in that book was that when you take a look at the distributive bargaining and you combine it with fear, control, certain kinds of attitudinal structuring, and certain divide and conquer and solidarity within, what you get is the simultaneous presence of the sub-processes in a way that produces unrestrained forcing. if you have integrative bargaining paired with just untempered trust and an emphasis only on internal consensus, you get this kind of superficial fostering, and the sub-processes don't connect across each other. And for us, for me, this was critical in the sense that you can take tactical behavioral moves and have them add up to different strategies, which makes the combination of forcing and fostering really almost impossible. In contrast, if you have this blending of the integrative and distributive with constructive framing and internal education, you get a more restrained kind of forcing, and you combine it with some what we call tough trust and an internal appreciation of diversity, you get a more robust kind of fostering where you can go back and forth as issues invariably force you to do, with forcing and fostering taking place in the same negotiations. And so I just wanted to share this in terms of that core insight of the book of the simultaneous presence of all four sub-processes as behavioral tactical moves. For me, the critical insight that I so appreciate is to then be able to combine them together into strategies that then have a life of their own. There's a lot more to be said about the book, and we have a number of folks who will be sharing those views. I'm going to begin by turning the program over to Max, who we'll still have you stand here if you're willing. But
I'm willing to do whatever you tell me to do. You're in charge. Yeah. So first of all, thank you to Tom and Joel for organizing this. This is wonderful. But more importantly, thanks to Dick and Bob for writing your book. I've spent my career as part of this field of negotiations, much more so than labor relations per se. And it's been a great field to be in for the last few decades. And it's totally unclear what the field will look like if you didn't write your book. So for all of us who have benefited from this booming field, thank you to both of you. Just a little bit of personal background. Tom and Bob hired me in 1983. My field was much more organizational behavior than labor relations. But Tom and Bob hired me, I think, against the wishes of the organizational behavior group at MIT. I did a little bit of arithmetic. I think, Bob, I think you were about 5 years younger than I am right now when you hired me. And I'm going to come back to that sort of age observation in a little bit. I also taught negotiations with Bob at the Sloan School at MIT. I really wasn't a particularly good partner. The course started on February 14th, 1984, and you might be wondering why I would remember the date so clearly, and the answer is I broke my hip in a skiing accident 2 days before the course was supposed to start, and wasn't allowed to leave my condo for most of that semester. So Bob taught our joint course by himself, with a little bit of help from Len Greenhouse, who regularly drove down from Dartmouth to help both of us out. My job, as Joel instructed me, is I'm supposed to talk about sort of psychology and the behavioral theory of labor relations, and sort of the influence that this amazing book has had on the study of psychology of negotiations, which has been quite a boom topic over the last few decades. And to put that into context before making some content remarks about their effect on the psychology of negotiations, I think it's important to put the field of negotiation into context as of 1965. Economists, by and large, were writing formal models based on a full rationality assumption. Other social scientists were offering descriptions with little or no notion that these descriptions were supposed to feed into advice on how to negotiate more effectively. And what we've seen in recent decades is negotiations is quite dramatically a descriptively informed prescriptive field. And I think so much of this idea that we can advise people on how to negotiate more effectively based on an understanding of how people naturally do behave in negotiations really comes out of this book, and I would say 17 years later, the work of the Art and Science of Negotiation by Howard Rafa. And I think these two books really were the pivotal intellectual contributions that allowed us to start to think about how do we use description to create more effective prescription. And I'm going to make just kind of one or two comments on each of the four sub-processes. One, in terms of distributive processes, I think that this book provided us with the first comprehensive set of insights on why it is that people might not reach an agreement when a positive bargaining zone exists. And that's been a critical challenge that we've been working on for the last 50 years, I hope somewhat successfully. Even a broader influence is the work on integrative processes, where so much of the field has studied why it is that people don't reach Pareto efficient agreements. Why do people have a mythical fixed pie that keeps them from finding gains from trade and integrating their interests? Attitudinal restructuring. I think that Joel's wonderful chart really misses on attitudinal restructuring, but it's not Joel's fault, it's Bob and Dick's fault. That was a really bad subtitle. I mean,
some of us have never forgiven you.
The word is influence, and that's been a boom topic for the last many decades. Bob Cialdini has written a very, very influential book called Influence. He got the right title, and so many of the excellent findings that Cialdini highlights, the nuggets are within the attitudinal structuring part of the behavioral theory of labor relations. So we see that come alive, but it's a term that didn't live as opposed to the ideas. And I mean, the other thing about influence is that any of us who teach negotiations and run into people in the real world, we kind of focus primarily on integrative and distributive. And when they say negotiation in the real world, they actually mean influence. That's largely what sort of the first approximation of what this field is about from people in the real world. And finally, intra-organizational bargaining. I think that, again, I don't think that the term has thrived, but Jim will be talking soon, but intra-organizational processes lives well in the work of Lax and Sebenius. It lives well in lots of different places. And in terms of the psychology of negotiations, one of the most common mistakes that people make in negotiations, in complex negotiations, is that they assume that the other side is monolithic. They basically ignore intra-organizational bargaining processes, and this ends up being a fundamental flaw. So much of what has thrived in recent decades, if you go back and take another look at Bob and Dick's book, there's so many seeds that you'll find throughout their work. I just came back from Patagonia, and I took the paperback version with me, and it's just stunning to see how many things that we talk about. You can see the seeds in their earlier work. But finally, I want to talk about the psychology of how scholars respond to different approaches to knowledge, because I think there's something fascinating there as well. There's a play called Red, and it's about how Rothko dealt with his the people who preceded him and how he reacted to his followers, and it was an insightful play in terms of thinking about how different generations react to each other. I want to go back to something Tom alluded to, but I'm going to read to you a little bit, because I think it really helps put everything into context. So I'm being a little bit redundant with Tom, but I'm going to read from his work, which is from the foreword of the 25th anniversary edition of this work. Tom writes, the authors knew just enough to be relevant, but given the advantage of their youth, not too much to lose the ability to step back and abstract and generalize and conceptualize what they observed. And like others who challenge a prevailing paradigm, their work was not immediately received with open arms. by their senior colleagues, nor was it immediately acclaimed to be a seminal breakthrough. And he then goes on to talk about Northrop, and he writes, Northrop seemed to approve of the ways Walton and McKersie used their gifts, experience, knowledge, and case examples well, but when faced with concrete situations. But he criticized the authors for introducing needless new jargon to define and describe the bargaining processes in terms of the 4 sub-processes of negotiation. And he goes on to talk about how the abstraction, and it's clearly the abstractions that have lived for the last 50 years, were not seen as part of what scientists did. And I found that kind of fascinating to read Tom's summary of that. And it so reminded me of my showing up at MIT in 1983 as an assistant professor, when by any stretch of the imagination, what I was doing in terms of my own work was far and distant from the field of labor relations. Tom and Bob were intrigued by a study I did where I captured the decision processes of actual arbitrators in a linear model, which many of them found quite offensive. And certainly nothing looked remotely like that in the labor relations field. And as I was reading Tom's words, I was struck by the fact of how Bob and Tom were so welcoming of a very different way of thinking about this research topic. And now that I'm 59, I was going to come back to the fact that I'm older than Bob was then, I find myself confronting a new generation of scholars who do the kinds of things that I do in different ways. They use big data. They collect their data using something called MTurk. They run experiments over the web without ever seeing their subjects. They're doing neuroimaging work. They're using physiological measures. And quite honestly, my first reaction is, I don't like much of it. But I think back to this and I think, it doesn't really matter that I don't like it. There's going to be new directions, new ways of doing things, and that's the way science evolves. And I want to thank you, Bob and Tom and Dick, for creating an opening for me to do the work that I've done, and the generosity of having an openness about the scientific process that sounds like perhaps some of the people who preceded you might not have had to such a warm degree. So thank you very, very much.
So next we have Hannah, and
Can you stand or?
yeah. Well, you want to come up here, maybe?
Sure. How does this guy work?
And Autumn moves it forward.
This forward?
Yep.
Okay, good.
Let's sneak behind you.
Okay, go ahead. No,
a little
that's fine.
roomy here.
If I stand here, I can be seen, and I think this might be easier. And then, so I was asked to speak on gender negotiation. Actually, I'm taking Debbie Kolb's place, who sends her regrets. She actually would have loved to be here, but when I had the opportunity to fill her shoes, I grabbed it. I had the honor of being at Dick Walton's final doctoral seminar before he retired from the business school.
I had the honor of having you in that.
Well, you're very kind, and I'm actually confident that I can speak on behalf of my graduating class that yours was the most memorable seminar, most enjoyable and memorable seminar that we had, certainly. And I want to return back. I've learned also a great deal from Bob over the years. I want to come back to that in a moment. But so I've been talking about gender and negotiation. Looking back, how do we get is there a way to make this, maybe you can keep us over here, yeah. Oh yeah, maybe for
actually,
center.
here,
Let's see if we have,
let's try this.
oh yeah. Shrink the slide a little bit. Oh,
That's right.
beautiful. That should work. Okay, great. So when Walton and McKersie wrote A Behavioral Theory of the Firm, gender was not an analytic lens. It wasn't even really an important concept. If you look at the way gender was conceptualized back then, it was primarily as a trait. So it was a kind of a personality variable. One would imagine that women would be cooperative and men would be competitive. But this kind of trait theories of gender really never never gained much empirical support. They basically, as we experience in everyday life, sometimes women are more competitive than men more cooperative than women. There really isn't good evidence that men and women behave in particular styles systematically or consistently across contexts. It was also inconsistent with normative trends in that era because there's sort of the feminist ideal was toward minimal sex differences, and so that wouldn't have been embraced. So I think it makes a lot of sense that gender was not an important concept in looking back. I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature on gender employment negotiations that's kind of come up in the last 15 years in the fields of organizational behavior and psychology. This is a literature that's primarily about dyadic compensation negotiations as opposed to labor negotiations. I'm really one of these members of the negotiation field. It's also focused on management level employees as opposed to negotiations with workers lower on an organizational hierarchy. And it's also primarily lab-based. So it's actually quite different in many respects from the research that was done, or that undergirds the behavioral theory of labor negotiations. But I want to talk in a minute about how this field is actually very much in the spirit of a behavioral theory of labor negotiations. And this research has really been inspired by social psychologists' reconceptualization of gender as a social phenomenon as opposed to as a trait or a personality variable. What the social psychologists discovered was that if you really want to understand the influence of gender, you have to understand context. There are certain contexts in which men and women enact their gender. So for instance, men are more stereotypically male or masculine when they're hanging out with men, and women are more stereotypically feminine when they're hanging out with women, right? Now, if you look back, I'd like to connect now. So I was asked to connect in particular to the chapters on attitudinal structuring, and this is one of the models on the forces of establishing relationships. And so it starts here with antecedents, contextual factors, personalities, social beliefs, instrumental thinking and planning that influences parties' interactions at the table, and then their attitudes toward one another and toward the issues for negotiation or propositions that are on the table. These interactions then influence emergent relationship patterns, aggression or accommodation. And then there are these kind of long-term, what they call functional consequences of these relationship patterns. Really, what is put on the table and the type of agreements that are reached are influenced by the relationships that get formed by the parties. Well, if you look at how this research on gender and employment negotiation has emerged, it really follows this model in many ways, right? So we started out with a lot of attention to what are the contextual factors that are going to heighten the potential for gender to influence negotiations. One of them is ambiguity, which actually Walton and McKersie talk about. The more ambiguous the negotiation situation, the more potential there is for gender to influence the situation. How relevant and salient is gender? So wage negotiations are a space where we do tend to find gender effects. That's closely related to the fact that compensation is very masculine stereotypes. It's associated with the male breadwinner model. It's associated with higher levels of hierarchy and authority that tend to be associated with men. We also then focus on, what are social beliefs, in particular stereotypes, gender stereotypes that are going to influence or inform parties' interactions at the negotiating table. And in particular, a lot of the research that's been done has been around negotiating scripts. But if you look at the research by Babcock, Craig, Gelfand, Curhan, and I, a whole variety of folks, what a lot of us are really looking at is how context and social belief influence parties' interactions, specifically in heightening the potential for gender to be influential in behavior. And then we look at how the behavior that's gender influences patterns of interaction at the table, so the propensity for resistance to what somebody is doing or for agreement. And then we look at long-term, functional consequences of these interaction patterns, in particular for wage, and then also for the willingness to work with somebody. So for instance, one of the things that we found is for women negotiating for themselves for higher pay, they're sort of perceived as, more so than for men, they're perceived as kind of unattractive. Why are you asking so much for yourself? The sort of feminine ideal is that you're focused on others rather than for yourself. So what we found is not only a kind of resistance to what the woman is asking for, but also this decrease in the propensity to want to work with the woman because she's sort of perceived as too self-interested. I think it was actually in a PON seminar, an MIT seminar or something like that, where Bob McKersie said to us, well, why don't you think about what strategies would work? So very much in the spirit of Walton and McKersie, we got thinking about, well, what are the strategies that would work? And we tested, you know, a number of negotiating scripts, trying to figure out how could we make this work for women so people would be inclined to agree to what they were asking for, but they would also make the social impression that they wanted to make. And so we devised these negotiating scripts based on what we call relational accounts, or more popularized as I-we strategies. And these negotiating scripts that we tested were useful in both decreasing resistance, enhancing the potential for agreement, but also have implications for increasing wages and the willingness to work with the woman. So I just highlight this to show that, you know, even if we haven't picked up in particular on attitudinal structuring as a term or a concept, the spirit of how you conducted your research and developed your theory has been so influential in the way this kind of subfield of negotiation has evolved. Looking forward, I really hope that we'll continue in the spirit of Walton and McKersie, and particularly to develop more organizationally grounded theory development. In all candor, the current research is really dominated by studies about compensation, and I think we study compensation because there are easy numbers and we can set up easy lab negotiations around compensation, but if we're a little bit suffering from the looking under the lamppost, trying to understand the phenomenon. And so I and others, and I know Debbie Cole would agree with this, that I think we really want to understand the role of negotiation in phenomena such as the gender gap in compensation and authority. We really need to understand more broadly how negotiating over career trajectories influences these phenomena, and not just 20-minute or short conversations at particular points like organizational entry or promotion points. We need to think more broadly about that. So, so I'll leave it there. This was a really fun exercise, and I'm delighted to participate in this conversation.
Thank you. So, actually, next up is Mary.
Can we distribute those things to all? Will you help me?
Yes. So, yeah, we have some handouts. And by the way, from the slides that I did and that Tom did, those handouts are up here at the end of the session for anyone who's interested. But true to form, Mary is going to be presenting a systems perspective, and it's hard to reduce the systems to a simple PowerPoint slide.
I'm the odd practitioner in this group. And 42 years later and 20,000 cases later, I am absolutely delighted to be able to thank Dick Walton and Bob McKersie for having illuminated my life as a practitioner. I was ombudsman at MIT for 42 years. And what I had been thinking about doing, Joel, but didn't, was to have a before and after picture. You know, one of those before pictures. So here's the before picture from 1973 to 1985, trying to figure out how to work within a system to build a conflict management system. And here is after 1985, inspired by Walton and McKersie. I also taught negotiations at Sloan, off and on for 20 years with Bob McKersie. I was resonating to what Max said. I'm really incredibly happy to be here. Joel, you talked about the thousands of citations. I am here representing the millions of practitioners. And I really feel that very strongly, that the practice of negotiation and conflict management has changed a lot. So what do I remember very vividly in 1985, meeting Bob McKersie? First, if you have that folder in front of you, these are, by the way, the 1985 notes. Like everybody else, I read Walton and McKersie twice, very carefully, really worried that I lacked the intellectual prowess to be able to understand it. But then what I did was that I mapped it in idiot guidelines and discovered to my great delight that students liked it. So that's what you have. But please look at page 2. In 1985, I said to Bob, what is a negotiation? And Bob said something which I later remember these are my words, maybe they're Bob's. A negotiation is any interaction between two or more points of view. Bob, can you negotiate with yourself? Please look at the last thing on the quiz. Show of hands. Can you negotiate with yourself? Have you ever negotiated with yourself, right? This transformed my life, this idea that the tools of negotiation that were built on the scaffold that were given to us by Walton and McKersie, that these tools illuminate every one of our personal and professional interactions. I think, by the way, that that's one of the reasons that the book has thrived so, is that it gave us a scaffolding for Schelling, for Fisher and Urey, for many others of us to build. So then, Joel, if you would put up the peculiar slide. Pages 8 and 10 will show one of my own small attempts to build on the Thomas Kilmann graph that was put together on Walton and McKersie. Those of you who think about negotiations will remember that there's a piece of the graph up here. Up here is collaboration or integrative bargaining, and here is competition, distributive bargaining. When Thomas Kilmann put their graph on top of Walton and McKersie, as all the other speakers have said, so many people have built on that brilliant scaffolding. Here I am as a practitioner in my office, and I go to Bob and I say, Bob, supposing the real interests of one of the parties are to injure the other. So the basic book was kind of built about in positive terrain, where the value that's on the table in the northeast quadrant is to be divided between two people. But I was dealing with some people who actively wanted to take from others that which they had, and who indeed, in order to do that, would even be willing to injure themselves, like driving another person out of business by cutting prices. I lose money, but I drive him out of business. So I thought that this scaffolding gave me a sense that I could understand better what it was like to be a practitioner in the real world. And I wanted to mark for us for the future that understanding the nature of injury as a real interest is one of the tasks for the future. So then page 17 in what you have in front of you says tangibles and intangibles. Walton and McKersie gave us magnificently a framework for understanding relationship, attitudinal restructuring, inter-organizational bargaining, meaning what kinds of value do we have here? Much of it is not tangible at all. And they built a scaffolding, as you were telling us before, on which the work of neuroscience and Dan Kahneman and System 1 and System 2 thinking could be built. Back to real life talk from a real life practitioner. Have you ever taken your car to a place that charges more, but where you trusted the people there and you had a relationship? Whom would you choose as a doctor or a nanny? The intangibles were part of what Walton and McKersie gave us in an extraordinary way. Everything having to do with building trust. And then we have, on pages 21 and 22, one of the other things that I got from the book was the difference between choice of a strategy and being effective in that strategy. So much of negotiations before Walton and McKersie might have been, and again, I thought I heard a little of this in what you were saying and a lot in Hannah, which strategy we choose is only one question before us, but how are we to be effective in whatever strategy or tactics we use? This is a really big deal, and I studied it a lot as a practitioner. Okay, then in pages 24 and 25. Oh, this was my outline of the book. In case, how many people have read the whole book in the last week or so? Doing it. Those of us who had to speak here. 24 and 25 give you a bit of an outline of the book.
Thank you.
It was an absolutely fantastic outline, but let me tell you one other thing. I'm a practitioner again, right? What did it do for me? First, it permitted me to understand big chunks of the book and the theory and to read it over and over again. But it also permitted me to understand the strategy of a person walking into my office. 20,000 cases, 20,000 strangers. I suddenly in 1985 had a way of being able to make a guess from the tactics that were being presented in my office what the strategy and values were of the people, of the parties in my office. It was just the fact that Walton and McKersie can be used to diagnose a situation as well as to understand and plan it was very important to me. On page 26, by about the fifth time I read the book, I began to understand a very fundamental point. And that is whether you want to compete effectively, or collaborate effectively, or injure the other person effectively. There are two tasks that have to be done for each of these strategies. I must know my own interests and those of the other. Now, Sun Tzu said this millennia ago, know your enemy, know yourself, 1,000 battles, 1,000 won. But the idea that in my office, that in personal relationships, even if I wanted to injure somebody, I had to understand the interests of that person. Let me give you a mundane example. Supposing you wanted to punish a child who had been really dreadful in your home, and you sentenced them to eat only chocolate ice cream for the next week. Is that a punishment or is it not a punishment? You don't know unless you know the interests of the other. From that, I got that from Walton and McKersie in a most wonderful insight, and I was incredibly grateful. Joel, if you would be willing to put up the sources of power. I've been so pleased by all of the foregoing speeches. I thought it was only my own problems with the words. For attitudinal restructuring, I decoded this for myself with apologies to anybody whom I might possibly be offending. I loved your comment about influence and what Hannah said. I began to think about the sources of power in negotiation. For a long time, since the 1950s, there's been a standard list of 4 sources of power. And like other people, I added my own. But I want to draw attention in particular to one of them, there are flickers of this in Walton and McKersie, but there are flames of this in our modern world, which is force and coercion. Even a strike isn't usually force or coercion. But as Hannah and I both know, coercion is very deeply ingrained in the work of many of us who study race and gender. And coercion is very deeply in the news, if we think of, for example, interrogations. We might come back to that in questions, Dick, if you're interested. Okay, then a system. Walton and McKersie taught us about negotiating within constituencies. And this was one of the biggest things for me as a practitioner. Jerry Wiesner and Paul Gray, my first 2 presidents at MIT, were engineers, and they had taught me from the first days of 1973 that I must think of MIT as a system, taking a systems approach to conflict management. Fred Folks has done a lot of work in this area. And I worked very hard at it. I understood immediately what an elegant idea this was. I was very deeply interested in it. But it wasn't until 1985 that I understood that a systems approach might be built not just on functions of a system, but on the values and ideology and relationships and interests of the different pieces of the system. Forgive me for not having passed these out before. So I found myself, this is a wonderful example also of where what I learned from Walton and McKersie was not only of interest in understanding things, but in diagnosing a system. I don't know who in the audience might have a particular interest in internal conflict management systems, but let me say this about systems. There have been a great many very fine practitioners and academics in our field who have looked at one or another addition to conflict management systems, usually bringing in arbitration. I'm looking at Arnie Zach with love and affection, or mediation. But what I was taught from the beginning by my first two bosses was that a systems approach where all of the offices, including line management, within an organization where a conflict was being managed. And of course, that idea shines out of Walton and McKersie. So I learned quickly that a systems approach could be seen not just functionally, but in terms of the values and in terms of interests and rights and power. And that these ideas put out on a graph could help us to diagnose any system that one was working in. I have a version of this graph for anybody who wants it, but that has no offices on the left. It's just blanks for anybody to fill in the offices of their own system. And it permits us then to think about interests and rights and power in the context of all organizations around the world, cross-culturally and so on. So, like everybody else, I'm here to thank you, Bob McKersie and Dick Walton, for having given me a chance as a practitioner to thrive and grow. And I'll go back to sitting in my other seat.
And were you open to a question now, or?
I think there's questions later. No, I don't want to hold up.
Yeah, Bob and Dick have priority to ask any questions.
You mentioned interrogation. What did you have in mind?
Like other negotiations practitioners who have been watching the news about interrogations in the United States and in other countries over the last year since 2011, I have ruminated a lot about the sources of power in negotiations. What we think we've learned is that getting information from other people when we need it comes best from building relationships with them. Does this sound familiar to Dick Walton and Bob McKersie? Of course. From the intangibles, from building a platform, from robust pushing maybe, but not force and not injury. I think it's been just remarkably clear in the newspapers in the last few weeks how the sources of power and the systems approach ideas that Walton and McKersie gave us have begin to be so true just even in modern conundrums and problems in the newspapers. I don't know if that was clear, but thank you.
Thank you.
Let's say thank you, Mary. As you can see, Jim, I'm going to have you come up here if you don't mind. As you can see, we've been going across a wide range of fields, disciplines, and domains. The last one, by way of formal remarks, is the business context. And we asked Jim Sabinius if he would look back and look ahead.
No slides, but deep appreciation. When Tom and Joel asked me if I would, if I'd be willing to speak, I was delighted, but I didn't really know how much rereading this book would be a pleasure. First of all, I realized how much I missed in earlier readings and how relevant this book is, not only to my own work, and I'd like to speak personally a bit about that, but to what strike me as some ongoing, pretty fundamental confusions in the field. I might recommend that a lot of quite prominent scholars and others should reread this carefully to clarify some elements that I want to highlight. I was struck in reading it with how close to practice and how familiar with the labor relations context Bob and Dick were, and how that was so important, but probably so differently from the earlier labor relations writers. It was almost as if they engaged the strategic and the strategic and decision analytic structures that had been building up. It was as if John Dunlop actually understood Howard Rafa and Tom Schelling and began to synthesize them and got something valuable out of them that frankly was not available without both the institutional knowledge and the capacity to generalize and conceptualize. And so what they did was also positive social science in the traditional sense of describing and explaining. But as Max said, it was so close to practice that while these are descriptions and explanations, they really are a baby step toward people who want to negotiate more effectively. And the Rafa's asymmetrically prescriptive, conditional on an empirically and theoretically informed description of what's likely to happen is just a natural step forward from what they did. And I look at that as a combination of deep institutional knowledge, a respect for theory, and out of this comes something of great power and durability. I thought I would speak first about the intra-organizational piece, which actually shocked me when I saw Joel's graph that had sort of fallen off the charts. Dick Neustadt, who's a wonderful scholar of the presidency and a great human being, one of the first things he said to me as I was talking about negotiation was, "Jim, you know, reality is not bilateral." And he was speaking of a lifetime of work. And what he essentially meant was the notion of monolithic parties is a fantasy. I mean, it's a simplifying assumption, has its value, but it really isn't that. And this, you know, in the behavioral theory, this was really the first systematic exploration of the unexpected, at least to me, dynamics of both the negotiations across the table, on each side of the table, and the interactions among those. And this so enriched the fairly stylized economic principal agent models, which I was very familiar with at the time. And frankly, when David Lax and I wrote The Manager as Negotiator, we wrote one of the hardest chapters that we tried to write and then subsequently expanded on was the notion of the manager in the middle, obviously dealing with subordinates and superiors. But also, if you negotiate a contract or a merger, you've got to get it ratified, and that's often a complex interaction going forward. If you are managing a team, the team dynamics and the broader organizational context, if there's a joint venture, the structure of internal and external, or the challenge of productively managing the internal and external negotiations is, I think, really key here. And what's interesting is outside of these fields, I probably spend more of my time out of the managerial realm and more in the international relations realm. And there, probably the most famous article on bargaining in international relations, outside of Tom Schelling's work, is Bob Putnam's work on two-level games, which is an exploration of the interactions between domestic politics and international diplomacy. And it's an elegant work, and rereading that, I knew that they referenced Walton and McKersie, but what Bob Putnam said almost at the beginning of the article is that the behavioral theory of labor negotiations is strikingly applicable to international conflict and cooperation. And the metaphor carries over almost perfectly. And what I must say is what they refer to as level 1 negotiations, typically across the table, level 2 negotiations on each side of the table, in the first instance to ratify what's gotten done at the table, turns out to be a very rich conceptualization. And in our great negotiators that we have been honoring and studying over the last 14 years at the program on negotiation, this theme of level 1, level 2 negotiations and the sophistication of the different players is really remarkable. For example, when we looked at Jim Baker and his role in the reunification of Germany within NATO, you saw this extraordinary. Baker has a reputation as a sort of a hardball, tough Texas negotiator, and he certainly is that. But he's way more than that. The sophistication with which his side was working with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze to manage and help them with their behind-the-table problems. Obviously not gloating or saying, hey, we won, and making it harder for them, but packaging things so that it would give the other side something they could sell to their players, when there was an inflammatory statement that seemed counterproductive at the bargaining table, if you understood through back channels that that was for internal Soviet consumption and don't, let it go because you'll be able to work it there. And even this extraordinary episode where Baker, for example, and George Bush I actually orchestrated major changes in NATO together with the Soviet foreign minister so that they could undercut Gorbachev's domestic hardline opponents at a critical point in the negotiation. I mean, just this interaction between the two sides. Whereas if you thought Soviet American, you would completely miss the utter sophistication of these sort of level 2 strategies. And that is really, I think, first crystallized beyond the simple abstraction in the interorganizational bargaining world. And I think that fall off of citations is probably more a terminological issue than a conceptual or real one. But in the managerial realm, this is obviously central. But I thought I'd actually mention, I said that there were a couple of places where rereading Walton and McKersie struck me as quite enlightening about things that to me seem confused sometimes, even among pretty sophisticated people. Their big contributions in most people's minds are crystallizing distributive and integrative sub-processes of bargaining, and everyone's mentioned that, and rightly so. What's interesting is the question, if you press people, are integrative and distributive, are these behavioral or styles of bargaining? Or are these substantive and structural aspects of the underlying situation? Or both? And if so, what's the relationship between those? Because you'll often hear someone says, that's an integrative issue, essentially meaning that there's a resolution that both sides prefer. Or that's a distributive issue, meaning any change in resolution that helps one side unambiguously hurts the other. That's independent of behavior or style. Then on the other hand, you'll hear integrative bargaining equals cooperative, collaborative, joint problem solving, all the good things that the program on negotiation stands for. And that's independent of the underlying structure in many usages. Or you'll hear that distributive bargaining, that's the bad kind in Polish, is competitive, contending, hardball, win-lose. But again, often stated without respect to whatever the underlying structure actually is. And it's when you read Walton and McKersie with new eyes, you realize how aware they were of this relationship between behavioral and structural, and how clear they were. And I realized that when David Lax and I wrote 3D Negotiation, which we'd been working on for a while, set up deal design and tactics, set up putting the thing together with all the moves away from the table, deal design explicitly focused on the underlying structural piece and the potential for joint gains that inheres in different structures, as well as tactical. And these are dimensions, they're not different models, they're dimensions of the same underlying situation. And I realized that, I was so dissatisfied with the notion of personally, with integrative issues and distributive issues, because it was just manifestly wrong analytically, particularly when I was much more mathematically inclined and could write papers that I can't read now. But I realized the question that triggered in me it ended up being a big part of my dissertation, which was, where did joint gains actually come from? And could I completely mathematically characterize differences in endowments, preferences, productive capabilities, forecasts, risk aversion, time preference, and characterize all of the joint gains that could come out of those, and the characteristic forms of agreements that would unlock those joint gains. Now that was pure substance. Then the question of tactics, what enables or retards the realization of those gains. And it was, that was very much sort of clarifying this structure versus behavior aspect, that when you read all the tensions and dilemmas of integrative and distributive bargaining, these guys nailed it 50 years ago. And a lot of people could benefit from a close rereading that I just did, not in Patagonia, but on the beaches of Vieques. Do you have time for a second challenge?
Sure.
All right, because I could go on for a while, and I will want to leave some time. The other question has to do with something that Dick and Bob were very clear on, but lots of other people aren't, which is to say, are integrative and distributive processes separable, or are they linked and intertwined in any fundamental ways? Now, you'll commonly hear versions of the following. Integrative bargaining is better than distributive bargaining, or interest-based joint problem solving is better than positional bargaining, or win-win is better than win-lose. And these tend to be ideological rather than analytical statements. And it's because one of the richest and most sophisticated parts of the behavioral theory is all the tactical and other dilemmas that relate these two one to the next. Because after all, the pie is expanded, if at all, to whatever extent, and the pie is divided in whatever proportions. These are not different things. And when you look at it either highly analytically or in practice, the way you expand the pie often influences the division, and the battle over the division of the pie often influences how big it actually is. So the question becomes something that David Lex and I really focused on, and really in our view is sort of the heart of the manager as negotiator, is saying what is the relationship between these two processes? And we crystallized it in the so-called negotiator's dilemma, and one implication of which is that the competitive moves to claim value individually, offensively or defensively, tend to drive out the cooperative moves that are necessary to create value jointly. And the question is not, is win-win better than win-lose, or interest-based joint problem-solving better than positional bargaining, or things like that, but no, they're both present. The question is, what's their precise relationship one to the next, and how do you most productively manage that tension over time? And it just strikes me that, rereading it, I said, boy, we learned a lot. And the attitudinal restructuring chapter, quite independently of its influence implications, is also how do you shift a relationship toward something where that tension will be productively managed. And I think that's another sort of underappreciated piece of what they've actually done. The last very quick piece that I would mention is one of terminology, because while integrative and distributive essentially became terms of art under Walton and McKersie, to lay people, they really are gibberish. Integrative, what is that? Something if you went to college, you suppressed from having studied calculus? I mean, what does integrative actually mean? And that actually led David and I think we were the first to systematically use it, but I could well be wrong. We said integrative is better understood as creating value. That's consistent with economic usage, business strategy, marketing, and so forth. Creating value and gains from trade and so forth is key there. Value claiming has actually run into a buzzsaw of people don't like that relative to distributive, although people much prefer the sort of neutral term of allocating value or distributing value or apportioning value. We actually chose that because what people do when they try to get a bigger share is to claim more value, and done in a way that's not sensitive to these pieces, you often run into big problems with that lead to the challenges and the dynamics. And so we ended up using this claiming value as an alternative term to distributive bargaining, as both descriptive and as a key ingredient in pointing toward one of the pathologies that you're trying to actually manage in the process. So integrative and distributive sort of led us to creating and claiming value. And creating value, I think, has become pretty widespread. Claiming value, much more contested. But either way, our debt to these two is just really large. So thank you personally, professionally, and intellectually.
Super, thank you. Before we turn it over to Bob and Dick, I do have the slides that David Lipsky sent, and I just want to share one or two of the things that he had prepared. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to say, Jim, as you were talking, it took me back in time, because the strategic negotiations book was prompted by a meeting in Bob's office in which we were talking about, well, what is this? Is integrative and distributive, as you were saying, something that is functional and structural, or is it process? And it led us into this notion of adding strategy and structure to the theory. And I'll never forget that Bob and I started the conversation. He said, "Hold it," and he called, and Dick, you came over, and it led to a whole book. My job here was more to tee things up, but you just took me back in time to that, and I wanted to share that. But a couple of things that Dave Lipsky was going to share with us. He's unfortunately has flu and also was snowed in Ithaca. The combination of two turned out to be not able to overcome. But he too, in his comments, wanted to emphasize that distributive is not zero-sum, and that integrative isn't just interest-based bargaining. And so I think it takes us into a whole discussion of, coming back to the core theory and appreciating it, not just what people have done with it. He was going to take us through some discussions. But looking ahead, he too picked the intra-organizational. We ended up in strategic negotiations, calling it internal negotiations, in an attempt to not be quite as burdened by the original formulation, but also said that this is an area that is still ripe for additional work, and I certainly couldn't agree more. But also, and it echoes what Mary said in her remarks, wanted to even see more work around the role of third parties and how that fits into what the behavioral theory has to say to us. So I know David couldn't be with us, but I wanted to give us that additional piece of what he had brought, looking at it through this kind of workplace dispute resolution lens. But that's enough. I think the reason we're all here, besides wanting to share and honor from our own work, is to appreciate this rare moment of having Bob and Dick together, and the floor is yours.
You can tell who the senior offer is. No, I'm happy to go first. In fact, some people think my first name is Walton. When you keep hearing this Walton, McKersie, actually, hearing your name when you're our age and it's after lunch, it keeps us awake, doesn't it, Dick? It's like your mother saying, Walton, Walton, Walton. Stay alert. Anyway, this is a really special moment for all of us. And Tom recognized our family. I guess I should say that one of the advantages of waiting 50 years to have this kind of celebration is we've been able to produce children and grandchildren to pack the audience. But I really appreciate all the folks who have come. My wife would love to be here. I came up from Florida on Friday, and I'm going back tomorrow. And she wanted to stay down because our other daughter is still there on vacation. Anyway, she sends her regards and is sorry not to be here. I guess the other thing I would want to say about the family connection is that when Dick and I finished our studies at Harvard Business School in 1959, he went to Purdue and I went to Chicago, and we had started to work on the book at that time, but the real serious work was ahead, and it took about 5 years from 59 to 64. The book came out in 1965, and we would meet frequently in Kankakee and other sort of midway places between Chicago and West Lafayette. So our family was kind of part of this process where Dick and I would be off huddling, and our wives and the kids would be doing other things. So in a sense, having a family here is very important because that's a large part of how this whole thing developed. I also want to say something about the folks who have been up here talking about the book. As you can see, the most latest example, as Jim Sabinius talked about claiming value and creating value, that these folks here have made major contributions. I mean, this field is, in a sense, not our field, Dick and I, but it's a field that's been, in a sense, addressed and pushed forward in so many different ways by people who are here on this platform here this afternoon, and particularly by the program on negotiations. But I also want to say something about two people here who I've been co-authors with, Joel and Tom. Neither of them had the wisdom, before they asked me to be a co-author, to talk to Dick. You didn't know what you were getting into. Anyway, so the two of them are co-authors, and as you heard, Mary Rowe and I taught many sessions together in negotiations, and I'm going to say something about that diagram she had up here. She and others are saying things, Dick, about our book that I'm not sure we should really take full credit for. I mean, there's been some, sort of hyperbole here today.
I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I say, did we really have that great idea in the book? Well, we'll take credit, but I mean, so many good things have been said that I sometimes wonder if they really were in our minds when we put that down. And Dave Lipsky, I'm sorry if we have a way to send something back to Dave. Dave has a MIT PhD, and he learned something about negotiations as he was a dean at Cornell, an experience I had, and that sharpened, in a sense, some of my ideas that I put back into the classroom. The other thing I want to say before making just a few unrelated comments is that Dick and I stood really on the shoulders of Professor Ben Seligman, a name that most of you wouldn't recognize in this room. Ben came to the Harvard Business School as a Kirsten professor. He had a career working with the Russell Sage Foundation, studying conflict. He had a couple of books on conflict in Canada. He had studied some of the industrial representation systems that were really a precursor to formal collective bargaining. He had a book with a wonderful title called Postponing Strikes. In a sense, how could you get in there as a mediator or an arbitrator and avoid strikes? And he offered a course in which he had transcripts, I don't know how he got them, of actual negotiations and talking about, in a sense, grounding yourself and getting, kind of into the territory. He would get us in as students to look at the behavior back and forth, what's going on here. And he had a framework. His framework was power and also a spectrum of relationships. In a sense, the whole opportunity to move collective bargaining from conflict or arm's length over to cooperation and other positive forms of the relationship. So I just want to, since we're in a sense saying something about this book of 50 years ago, I want to, in a sense, peel it back one layer prior to the work of Ben Seligman. His best-known book is entitled Power and Morality. And Ben died, I think, the way most of us who want to keep teaching. He died in the classroom teaching the advanced management program on a Saturday morning at Harvard Business School. Okay, those are just kind of the preliminaries. I fortunately have had the opportunity over the last 5 decades to kind of stay in the field doing arbitration, mediation work. Bill Yeager is here from the Clerical and Technical Workers Union at Harvard. I've been doing some work with them. I do work in my hometown of Arlington. Tom in getting the Massachusetts Education Partnership going, where we're working with school systems, introducing some of these ideas to have things go better. I've done some work there. So I've got some data kind of from this kind of firsthand involvement. And one of the things I want to say, and it isn't just in the labor area, is how tough it is sometimes to get to the table, to get the parties into the beginning stages of a relationship. And certainly those of us who have watched the decline of the labor movement would put this in this very framework, that we have so many managers today who do not want to have a representative of their workers at a bargaining table with them. I mean, that's another way of saying they don't want to have a relationship with a bargaining agent, which is another way of just saying what's back of that decline in the union movement. And in some ways, I think we almost need to have a theory, which Dick and I never thought we would need to do, because in the 1950s, there were so many established relationships there to study. But what about the situations where one side would like to have a relationship, and that's going on now with the protesters who would like to have a relationship with some people who can make some changes in a variety of agenda items. I can also bring it back to the labor field. I had the privilege of serving as a director of a steel company where they had strong relationships with the steelworkers, but that very same management did not want to have a bargaining relationship with its white-collar workers. And they worked hard, in a sense, to keep the union and a bargaining relationship away. Now, when I go back and reread the book, Dick, we have this phrase there called mutual dependency. And we studied relationships where they were mutually dependent. But there are so many situations in the world where there's not mutual dependency, but where negotiations might, in a sense, make a difference. Over the time I've had in Florida the last couple of weeks, I've had a chance to read Lawrence Wright's new book, 13 Days in September, about Camp David. I recommend that book. It's a great book. I mean, a lot is known already about what Jimmy Carter did in Camp David, but Lawrence Wright has put his mind around that story. And that's a situation where one party, particularly Begin, he did not want to be in those negotiations. Sadat did, of course, because he had gone, if you remember the story, he had gone he made a trip from Egypt to Israel and, in a sense, set the stage for what Jimmy Carter could do. But the whole process in that book of how Jimmy Carter got Begin to want to be part of a real negotiation, not just sitting off in his room saying no, 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 no. So I think there's a whole subject area here of what I would call how relationships get started and how mutual dependency, in a sense, becomes a reality. The other generalization I would make. Before I do that, I should say, Mary, I think I've been influenced by this diagram you had up here, because another way of saying what I've just said about one side does not want to get into a relationship, it puts them into one of those other quadrants, doesn't it?
Or it may. Of course, they may be in a relationship and wish to injure. There are many relationships like that. But they may not be in a relationship and wish to injure.
Or they just may not want to be in a relationship. So they don't want to be in that northeast quadrant. They just want to be somewhere else. They don't want to be, in a sense, interacting with a party that, in a sense, has a reason for wanting to come to the table. The other thing I want to say, and there's been, in my field, a lot of literature about constructive relationships, examples of labor management relations working very positively, delivering value. And what I've observed is, in a sense, the fragileness of strong relationships and almost a reversion to the mean in so many situations, back to more traditional arm's length relationships, or, in a sense, what one of the steel leaders called professional adversarialism. Meaning, okay, we're dealing together, but we're not necessarily going to call it a partnership. That's a term that's used a lot today, partnerships. And there's, I guess, a reason for this. I get some of my insights from my daughter, Allison. She was actually chair of the negotiating committee for the teachers union where she teaches in New York City. And we were having this conversation just last week. And we were reflecting on why is it so hard for that relationship there between the teachers and administration to move beyond arm's length relations, beyond it's professional, but it's not, it's missing some of the value. And one of the things she said to me, she said, Dad, she says, teachers don't trust representatives who are in a trusting relationship with management. Wow. Teachers do not trust representatives who are in a trusting relationship with management. And that requires us almost to go back. Why is it that we assume that our agents always have to be in arm's length relations to be doing the best job for us? What is it about our culture that, in a sense, leads us down this avenue that we always want relationships to be formal, legalistic, and if a leader comes out and, in a sense, starts to look like he's consulting too much with management, that leader has some political vulnerability. At least this is often the case in labor management relations. And it's worth a discussion. And some of it goes back to the intra-organizational subject, that negotiation of the agent back to his members. It's difficult for that agent to bring them along to understand that a trusting relationship with management is going to be in their advantage. And he's not just getting co-opted. He's just not, in a sense, losing his edge that gives them, in a sense, the best outcome. So I'm about ready to stop, Dick. So I'm giving you a kind of 1 minute warning here. I had a chance to go back and do some.
You have to wake up.
To go back and do some rereading, and if you remember the book, we didn't want it to be just, in a sense, embodied in labor management relations. We wanted it to also, in a sense, test our kind of framework against international, and when we used the Cuban Missile Crisis for international, and then we used some work. It was the 1960s. Civil rights was big thing, and I was in Chicago. So I just reread that section there on protest movements in the civil rights context, and there's a whole list of characteristics, and Dick and I were talking about this just a few minutes ago, that apply to the protests today. Are, in a sense, they focused? Are they asking for things that, in a sense, can bring them to the negotiating table? Are there leaders? Are they avoiding violence? I mean, a whole series of things, so that it's exciting, in a sense, to go back and think about how this subject, and this is a lot in Mary's realm and Dave Lipsky's realm of conflict resolution procedures, how to think about protest movements from this same perspective that we've been talking about here. But I really thank the panel here and Tom and Joel for staging this. And I don't know when the next celebration is going to be. We had one for 25 years, and now here's one.
Actually, in March, and I'll say a little bit about that. But it's still the 50th celebration.
Okay. All right. Thanks, folks. All right.
Well, I agree with what he said. I'm overwhelmed by the kind of analysis of the book and the attribution of its influence on subsequent scholarship. And it may be overstated, but we'll just live with that for the time being. And I'm indebted to those people who have taken ideas, created their own original ideas, and have advanced our understanding in a way that has been characterized. Looking back, I absolutely agree that we didn't get a good label, a good way of thinking about the influencing the relationship, the attitudinal structuring. It just was never quite right, but it's powerful. And when we look at what you've talked about in terms of subsequent research, so an enormous amount of attention to that. And then to the internal negotiations, again, I think that's where, at least my understanding of the state of the art right now, is that we need a lot more understanding. Now, I talked with Bob when all this stuff came in, and I realized I'd been out of I hadn't read the literature for 15, 20 years, and I hadn't really kept that current with the negotiation literature. I was into organization design and organization development and group dynamics and team building and interpersonal relations. And so I hadn't kept up with the literature. So a lot of this was news to me, and we came up with the Rip Van Winkle phenomenon. I mean, here I am. Oh, good God! And so, as Rip Van Winkle, my antenna went out. Well, I can't believe the richness that the world provided me with. Ferguson. No, Ukraine. There you go. They just dished me up the conflict within the Ukraine and then the conflicts between the Western powers and the Soviet powers, and then the alignment problems within the EU and within the Western powers, and I realized how rich the question of how do you get basically two parties, but one party that is comprised of so many different entities, Germany with its own economy and so on. And then each of the NATO countries that are on the previously in the Soviet domain. So that the notion of being able to take, in that case, a system of conflict, but you could put it into a general negotiation paradigm, the East, Soviet, and the West. And then you could look at the intra-party negotiations and the influencing the relationship, because all kinds of relationships going on there. So I thought, oh God, keep it coming, keep it coming. And I got a case study on this. Okay, all right. Lord, Syria. They dished up Syria for me. Now Syria is different. It's international, but it isn't a kind of West and East. It's a broken compasses conflict case. Broken compass in the sense that if for the U.S. were due north and ISIS is south, where is Iran? Well, it breaks the compass. So when you now have parties that are competitors but are allied implicitly in action, how do you handle that? Well, it is all over the map there. In terms of the U.S. looks at that, and the Kurds look at that, and so, wow, keep it coming. Again, I've got now another case study, and if we describe this, so what I'm trying to get at is conflict systems, expanding conflict systems that are not simply a negotiation, but may be characterized by a negotiation between East and West, the Ukraine, but maybe simply that they're all interrelated set of conflicts, but they're not interrelated in the sense of that your enemy's enemy are that blah blah blah. Okay, so I think that's. Then there's a third. I mean, you can't believe what Rip Van Winkle has been able to try and absorb and try and diagram, because he wants to teach a course at the Harvard Business School with a series of case studies. Well, Ferguson, Lordy gumption, you get Ferguson, and then Staten Island, New York, and then Cleveland. And all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but rapidly enough, you've got conflict at all levels and in various ways between organized groups, unorganized groups, the protest groups, and so on. And so the question here is, how do you describe this? And describe it in a sense, in a way that you can later identify choice points, at a way that you could say, in retrospect, somebody acting in Ferguson or in New York at this point, and you've got it all laid out what's going on. And by the way, it's so easy to write these case studies now because they're so thoroughly covered by the media that you almost don't have to put anybody into the field. Maybe a few choice points to find out how the mayor of New York felt about X or Y, but so and I think you can, if you identify these choice points as you go, you can come back to them later and puzzle. If you then are developing some theory as well as a map of it, what might have been done. And then there's Hong Kong. You know, where did it go? Why didn't it go? Did it ever become really an expanding conflict system? Well, what the thrust of this is that the challenge for me, and if I were going to teach that course, would be to try and understand this expanding complex systems in which there may be an overarching negotiation framework, as you might say you could apply in Ukraine, or lots of different negotiation here, there, that are all interrelated, each with a potential side effect of the other. So it's like an ant's nest. So that's, now I'm going back to sleep.
Well, I think you've had a real treat for a variety of different perspectives, and then the two masters getting the final formal word. But I would invite people here who have experience, worked with Dick or Bob or both, or thoughts on what you heard this afternoon, to offer your own comments or ask a question. Maybe they have the answers.
You'll have to wake up,
Saul.
Dick.
Hi, I'm Saul Rubenstein. I teach at McKersie. I just wanted to say a couple of words of appreciation to both Dick and Bob.
Saul, you might speak up just a little louder.
So I went to Harvard Business School, and my father told me to study with Dick Walton. But Dick, you were teaching in the executive program, so I read your cases and I read your work, but I didn't have a chance to study with you. But a couple of years later, in Linden Hall, the Steelworker Education Center south of Pittsburgh, you were there, and I was there, working with the steel industry, with labor leaders, with managers, trying to help the steel industry recover from the devastation that they were facing with international competition. And you were teaching them through the case method a different way to think about institutional integration, not just integrative bargaining at the individual level, but also really at the institutional level, trying to reshape the industry in terms of relationships between the union and the corporation at the national level, and as well as at plant levels. And then a couple of years later at a conference talking about this work, Bob said to me, why don't you think about applying to MIT? And so I got a chance to come to MIT and to study with Bob and to read the book for the first time in your negotiations class, and then in the second time with Tom in the IR theory class. And I guess what really stayed with me at an individual and personal level, as well as a professional level, is the way that both of you made such a contribution theoretically, but then also practically. that you got involved with the players and showed us ways to influence behavior, not just by what you had written, but by what you could teach, whether it's at Linden Hall or Bob's work on the board of Inland Steel, and then in so many other places. I mean, I still remember the trip to Saturn where you drove us on the test track. I still think about that.
So do I.
With Bob behind the wheel, that was neither, that was clearly a distributive, there was no intergovernmental negotiations, there was some attitudinal restructuring. But it's influenced my work, it influences the work that I've done as a professor, in the way I teach IR theory, in the way I teach work about labor management partnerships, but it also has influenced the work I do and the work I've done the last few years, looking at ways that public school, K-12 schools, are reforming as a response to the market-based reforms like charter schools, and looking at instances like the Massachusetts Educational Partnership that Bob and Tom have worked on. We in New Jersey have also been trying to create this, and at the core of it all is exactly the theoretical contribution that you made in trying to help the parties think differently about their relationships and about the ways that value can be added together. And I was invited to a meeting this fall that NEA ran, in which what they were specifically saying is, how do we take that particular model of negotiations and expand it to a strategy of changing the way schools are structured and the way schools can be improved. And so your work carries at both a theoretical and a practical level to this day. And I so much appreciate everything that both of you have taught.
I'll make a comment.
All right.
I'm daughter Beth Walton, and I was sharing with Tom earlier that growing up, we were always saying, you know, what do you do, Dad? Like, what is it that you do? And he would say, well, I help people get along. I go and I talk to the workers and I talk to the management, and we try and make things better for them. And sitting here has been such a treat for me because I have a little bit better idea of what my father does and how he's influenced people. I know he's very influential. I got the chance to sit in one of his classes at the B school, and I sat there thinking, is that really my father? Yeah, and feeling so proud of him. And I know as a family, we're just so happy to be here to support Bob McKersie and my dad, and it's really great to hear from other people who have been influenced by them. I think they're great, and I've been highly influenced by them myself.
McKersie, let me say I second everything Beth said.
All right.
Mike. Joel may want to piggyback on. Who are you? I'm about to do that. I wanted to get that out first next. Mike Wheeler, Program and Negotiation, Harvard Business School. And you've already alluded to this, Joel. We won't have to wait long for an encore. Joel and I and others at the Program and Negotiation have recruited many of the people we've heard from today to spend the better part of a day exploring both what has been and what will be the ongoing legacy of behavioral theory of labor negotiation. We will plumb some of the things in greater depth that we've explored today, and there are two things we haven't talked much about. You alluded to it briefly at the end, Bob, in terms of community stuff and your experience in civil rights. I will plug your recent memoir of that time, by the way. Very instructive in terms of your roots and your values. We'll also look at pedagogy, how Bob and Dick have taught us all how to be teachers, both in the classroom and beyond, as well as mentors. So we don't have to go to, let me do the math quickly, 2040 to imagine another convocation. This would be in early March, and we'll have articles in the negotiation journal from this as well. Joel, what would you add?
All the members of the panel will be part of that, but in each of the topics, there'll be 6 major topics: the integrative and distributive, the intra-organizational, and the attitudinal structuring or influence will be the first group of panels, each of which will have 4 or 5 people that will be putting their thoughts together. And then the second cluster will be a panel on the workplace, a panel on community, and a panel on pedagogy. And again, groups of 4 or 5 people in each topic, and then they will be producing something for the negotiations journal. But really the charge will be to take what happened here as the baseline and push it even harder to say, you know, what are the lessons looking forward? How do we build on the theory in the years to come?
Okay.
So consider this
coming attractions.
Part 1.
Good. Others? I'll just make one comment about the practicality of all of this and the intra-organizational bargaining. As some of you know, the city of Boston and the school department and the teachers unions, the union have just finally agreed to have a new plan for extended learning time for expanding the school day. They had failed in negotiations, in contract negotiations twice to try to reach that agreement, and then after about a year of trying to reframe it outside of the formal negotiations and help them to bring about a bit more of a collaborative problem-solving approach, we thought there was an agreement last June. As I just said, that agreement was just announced December 26th. The reason it was just announced December 26th is this little long-lost term called intra-organizational bargaining. Neither side had prepared adequately their constituents for a very transformative agreement, and it took another 6 months, basically, for them to work through those issues and basically put in place the agreement, which was pretty clear on paper 6 months earlier. So the power of this and the power of the parties and maybe the power of the facilitators not really encouraging or supporting the parties early enough to address those issues basically just led to a 6-month delay in reaching agreement. So you can see these terms and these processes playing out so vividly in almost, as Dick said so eloquently, any negotiations today. The concepts are just as relevant and maybe more relevant now than in the past. But we have one more task before we finish today, so I think we need Bob and Dick to actually stand up and maybe come out.
Well, actually, they can stay where they are, I think.
Can they? All right. But we have a little token of recognition from the Labor and Employment Relations Association to their book. This is 50. It took us 50 years to do this, I guess, but it's, I think, fitting that we recognize with a small plaque the contributions of the behavioral theory of labor negotiations to our field, to our profession, to all of us individually. So turn it around so that Susan can get a nice picture of the two of you with the plaque. Okay.